Hey there, everyone. I'm going to keep the intro super short today because I just have so much to do in this episode. Remember to like, subscribe, comment, and all of that jazz. I'll see you on the other side. Alright, kids, make sure you pay attention to the instructions, Iruka outlined, holding his hands up to get everyone's attention. In the back, beyond the rest of the Genin of leaf, cloud, and sand, as well as several more smaller nations, stood the Triumphant Six. Kids? Kiba echoed with a laugh, shaking his head. Though hunched in his stance, Kiba had seemingly stopped growing some time while he was away. Of the remaining 5 standing beside him, only Hinata was shorter than him. You've all signed up for the exams, which means there's no turning back now. I will now guide you into the classroom for your first phase of exams, Iruka instructed, waving for the army of ninja to follow him indoors. Meanwhile, though, the Triumphant Six remained outside. We are going to be fighting some of those kids later, Rock Lee mumbled, worried for them. I do not think that is a good idea. You can do it, team! Tenten shouted nearby with Shino's Shikamaru and Karin. Neji threw a side-eyed glance at her, annoyed by her encouragement. Such condescension. I'll have this challenge done in seconds. I like it, Choji defended, hands balled into fists as a smile creeped across his face. I underperformed during our showdown. Time to make all that back. All right, quiet down. A deeper voice came from behind, surprising all but Neji. Lord Jiraiya! Ino marveled, glad to see the Sannin had recovered enough to finally leave the hospital. Lord Hokage is busy today with the more complicated side of the chunin exams. Therefore, I'll be providing the instructions to your first challenge today, Jiraiya explained, waving for them to follow him. But you won't be taking any written exam. He walked at a normal speed, building the tension for them about where they'd be heading. Further back, Tenten, Shino, Karin, and Shikamaru kept up. Why are we watching their every step? Karin asked, annoyed that they weren't taking this day of zero responsibilities to eat at a restaurant or something. It's not every day the Hokage plans a unique challenge like this, Shikamaru pointed out. I want to see it. We already have agreed to stay out of it, Shino went on. The Hokage has allowed it, so we might as well take advantage. But if you want to tease them before their challenge begins, join in, Tenten laughed, shrugging at her harmless poking. Soon Lord Jiraiya's pace began to grate at their patience. The collective thought he was perhaps not taking them very far, yet here they were 20 minutes later, walking at a leisurely pace at their unknown destination. While the 6 competitors remained quiet and resolute, Karin and even Tenten began groaning that the wait was agonizing. Luckily, they weren't involved in the challenge, Shikamaru thought. Perhaps this was itself part of the test. He wondered just how in-depth those 6 would end up being challenged. Would they become physically exhausted or mentally? Maybe both? Reaching the north edge of town, Lord Jiraiya turned west, and followed the wall as it circled towards the great cliff the Kage heads were sculpted upon. At the base of the cliff, there was a rather unassuming single-person entrance into the black. Lord Jiraiya had to turn sideways and crouch slightly to fit through the hole, but he did not slow down a touch as the rest struggled in their own way to fit through the hole. As the Sannin walked down the descending steps, torches on either side sprung to life and remained alight for the remainder following after. Finally reaching the base of the stairs, Lord Jiraiya turned to the group and waited for them to properly gather before he continued. The 6 participants stood in a dimly lit underground chamber, the cold, damp air prickling at their skin. Torches lined the walls, casting flickering shadows that made the cavernous space feel even more ominous. The floor beneath their feet was slick stone, worn smooth by water that trickled down the walls. A low hum resonated through the air, almost as if something here, hidden in the black, was alive and waiting to reveal itself. Ahead of them, a massive stone archway loomed, its entrance shrouded in darkness. Intricate carvings of animals, mythical creatures, and twisting vines adorned the arch, each detail so lifelike it seemed like they might slither off the stone at any moment. Beyond it lay a sealed entrance to a dark unknown. Lord Jiraiya stood before them, arms crossed and a mischievous grin on his face. Despite the serious tone of the challenge, he looked almost too relaxed, as if he were enjoying the moment far more than he should. All right, brats, Jiraiya began, his voice booming through the chamber. Welcome to the first phase of your chunin exams. This isn't your run-of-the-mill, sit in a classroom and answer some boring questions nonsense. Oh no, we're doing things differently this time. He gestured grandly towards the dark maw of the entrance behind him. Behold, the underground maze of trials. Your objective is simple: survive, reunite with your teammates, and make it to the center of the maze. Easy, right? Neji's single eye narrowed as he studied the archway. Hardly. A maze like this is bound to be riddled with traps, all things that I will see far ahead of time. Exactly, Jiraiya said, clapping his hands and ignoring Neji's snide closing remark. This isn't just a test of strength or chakra, it's a test of everything. Your brains, your teamwork, your guts, and your ability to adapt. Each of you will start in a different part of the maze, completely separated from your teammates. Your first priority? Find each other. Your second? Make it to the center. Sounds straightforward, but don't let that fool you. This maze is full of surprises. Define surprises, Kiba muttered, scratching Akamaru's ear as the dog whined uneasily. Jiraiya smirked. Oh, you'll see. Some paths will lead you to your teammates. Others might lead you straight into traps, illusions, or, if you're really lucky, opponents from the other team. Speaking of which, he turned to glare at each of them in turn. If you run into someone from the opposing team, what you do is up to you. Fight them, evade them, strike a deal, whatever. But remember, points are awarded based on your actions. Points? Ino raised an eyebrow, crossing her arms. What kind of point system are we talking about here? Glad you asked! Jiraiya whipped out a scroll and unfurled it dramatically, the paper almost hitting Choji in the face. Here's how it works. You earn points for teamwork, strategy, and clever use of your abilities. You lose points for recklessness, leaving teammates behind or falling into traps repeatedly. Bonus points are up for grabs if you're the first team to reach the center together, or for other, more hidden secrets. Lee's eyes sparkled with excitement. Ah! A challenge that tests both physical and mental fortitude. This will be glorious. Hinata, standing beside him, gave a small nod but kept her gaze on the darkened entrance. What happens if we don't make it to the center? She asked quietly. Jiraiya's grin softened, and for a moment his tone grew serious. If you don't make it to the center, it doesn't mean you've failed outright. Your individual points will still be tallied, and you might pass based on your performance, but let me be clear, this isn't just about getting to the end, it's about proving you're ready to be chunin. Choji raised a hand hesitantly. What about the traps? Are they, life-threatening? Jiraiya barked a laugh. Of course! What kind of exam do you think this is? That said, you may find reprieve in all the madness as well. You'll need to think fast and act smart to avoid them. His grin turned sly. But don't worry, I've tested all of them myself. Well, most of them. Most? Neji's tone was as sharp as his glare. Relax, you'll all be fine. Jiraiya waved him off before continuing. Now, one last thing. Once you enter the maze, the doors behind you will seal. There's no going back. You're either moving forward or you're stuck until someone comes to rescue your sorry behind. Ino sighed and shook her head. Great. Trapped underground in a giant death puzzle. Just what I needed. Kiba chuckled, flexing his fingers. Sounds like fun. Let's see what this maze has got. A little too cocky, Kiba, Neji warned. Overconfidence will get you killed. Leave the bravery to the strong. All right, that's enough bickering. Jiraiya clapped his hands again, silencing them. You've got your mission. The proctors will be monitoring your progress from above, so don't think you can slack off. Now, are you ready? The 6 Genin exchanged glances, each processing the challenge ahead in their own little way. Some were nervous, others eager, but all of them were determined. Good, Jiraiya said, stepping aside with a dramatic flourish. Let the trials begin! With that, the massive stone doors groaned open, revealing the darkness within. One by one, the participants stepped into the maze, their figures swallowed by shadow as the doors began to close behind them. The moment Ino stepped into her portion of the maze, the cold, damp air closed in around her like a suffocating shroud. The faint torchlight barely lit the narrow corridor ahead, and the walls seemed to shift in her peripheral vision as if the maze itself was alive. She exhaled sharply, trying to push down the growing unease in her chest. "Isobu, you still there?" she asked in a low voice. "Always," the deep beast's deep, rumbling voice replied in her mind. "This place, not like..." Isobu rumbled within. Ino nodded to herself, steeling her nerves. She pressed forward, her footsteps echoing eerily. After only a few turns, she found herself at a crossroads. Her instincts told her to take the right path, but a low growl from Isobu gave her pause. Left then. There was a faint chakra disturbance there. Someone perhaps nearby. Ino wondered if Isobu was helping her more than it was letting on. She turned left, her heart pounding. The path grew narrower, the walls seemed to be closing in, and then suddenly opened into a small chamber. Standing there, looking just as tense as she felt, was Kiba. Akamaru barked once, wagging his tail in relief. "Ino!" Kiba called out, grinning. "About time I ran into someone. This place is a nightmare." Flapping its mighty wings, Kiba's great eagle summon cocked its head at him, and he nodded with a smile for it to go up in a puff of smoke and return from whence it came. "I've already hit some traps," Kiba explained. "I've been lucky. It's just been silent wandering," she replied, jogging up to him. "Any sign of Choji?" Kiba shook his head. "Not yet, but we're better off together than alone. Let's keep moving." As they left the chamber, Ino couldn't shake the feeling that someone or something was watching them. Isobu confirmed nothing. Neji walked through the maze with calm, measured steps. His Hageshi Byakugan was always active, the veins around his single eye bulging as he peered through the layers of stone and darkness. The walls to him were nothing more than faint outlines. He could see chakra signatures flickering like distant flames, some closer than others. "This maze won't hold me for long," he thought, his expression cold and focused. He turned a corner and paused, his eye catching the sight of two faint chakra signatures not far from his position. One was moving quickly, the other slower, hesitant. Rock Lee and someone else. He quickened his pace, weaving through the corridors with an efficiency that almost felt unfair. The maze's designers had placed genjutsu seals on some walls to block the Byakugan's vision, but they had no effect on his evolved eye. He could see everything. When he finally rounded a corner and saw Hinata ahead of him, her Sharingan flickering faintly in the dim light, she looked up in shock. "Brother!" she gasped, relief flooding her voice. How did you... "I saw you from the moment I entered," he replied coolly, stepping closer. "The others aren't far. Let's go." Hinata frowned, glancing around. "I can't see through the walls with my Byakugan. How are you—" "We'll discuss it later," he interrupted, his tone leaving no room for argument. "Lee's nearby. Stay close to me." Choji trudged through the maze with heavy steps, the dim light barely illuminating his path. His stomach growled, and he sighed. This place really knows how to put a guy in a bad mood. He paused at a fork, looking between the two paths. "Hanzo... Pain... always said to trust my instincts," he muttered, shaking his head at the corrupted information of his training as he veered down the right path. The corridor twisted and turned, each step feeling more aimless than the last. He was about to turn back when he heard the sudden faint sound of footsteps echoing through the maze. His heart leapt. "Hello?" he called, his voice bouncing off the walls. Suddenly, a figure emerged from the shadows. Rock Lee. Choji froze, his eyes narrowing. "Lee," he said, his voice low. "Choji," Lee replied, his tone calm but firm. "This is not the time for a rematch." "Maybe not for you," Choji snapped, stepping forward. "But I've got something to prove." Before Lee could respond, Choji lunged, his hand signs a blur. "Partial expansion jutsu!" His arm swelled to massive proportions, taking up the entire corridor's width, swinging towards Lee with incredible force. Lee leapt backward, effortlessly, his movements graceful. "We've all grown stronger, Choji, but this isn't the time, you know that." "Make time!" Choji roared, launching another attack. Lee dodged again, this time countering with a quick strike to Choji's side that didn't seem to have any effect. "I don't have time for this," Lee said, his voice filled with urgency. "I'm sorry." With that, he turned and sprinted down the corridor, leaving Choji behind. Choji clenched his fists, frustration bubbling within him. Digging his toes into the ground, Choji launched himself with all the explosive strength he could muster. Rock Lee raced through the winding maze, his focus honed on the task ahead. His mind was calm, almost serene, as he considered his next move. But a booming voice snapped him from his thoughts. "Lee!" Choji's voice reverberated through the maze like an avalanche, and Lee turned to see the larger ninja charging toward him, his footfalls booming like thunder. Lee blinked, his expression betraying both surprise and amusement. "Choji, I understand your distress," Lee called back, his tone light. "If you seek a rematch later, I will most assuredly accept." His words were cut short as the ground beneath him erupted, sending him stumbling back. A burst of chakra-infused earth had cracked the stone floor, nearly throwing Lee off balance. "It was Sakura that defeated me before, not you," Choji roared, forming hand seals in rapid succession. Lee's eyes widened as Choji unleashed a whip of fire, its searing heat cutting through the air with frightening precision. The flame grazed Lee's arm as he narrowly evaded, the heat biting into his skin. He winced, clutching the burn as he leapt back. "Impressive," Lee admitted, though his voice held a hint of disbelief. "But she had left the fight long before your collapse." Choji didn't let him finish again. His hands slammed together, sending jagged spikes of stone surging towards Lee. The lightly clad ninja jumped, but one of the smaller spikes clipped his leg, tearing through the fabric and scraping his shin. He stumbled on landing, his footing unsteady. Choji pressed forward, his chakra radiating like a furnace. "I'm not just an Akamichi anymore," he growled. "I've learned new ways to fight. I'm not the same Choji you claim to have beat before, and I won't let you brush me off." Lee, still underestimating his opponent, dashed forward in an attempt to close the gap. He aimed a swift kick at Choji's side, but the larger ninja was ready. Choji's arm swelled with his partial expansion jutsu, intercepting Lee's strike with a massive forearm. The impact sent a shockwave through the air, and Lee recoiled, his leg throbbing from the sheer force of the block. "Such strength," Lee muttered, his eyes narrowing. He tried to retreat, but Choji was relentless. Another fire whip lashed out, striking Lee's side and leaving a blackened scorch mark on his uniform. The searing pain forced a grunt from his lips as he stumbled into the wall of the maze. "Do you see now?" Choji said, his voice steady but filled with emotion. "You might be faster, but I've grown stronger. I've worked harder, and I'm not going to let you dismiss me like a small child looking to play tag." Lee's mind raced as he tried to find an opening. Choji's fire jutsu combined with his earth manipulation and just raw physical power left little room for evasion or counterattack. Every step Lee took was met with another strike, flames singeing his uniform, earth spikes scratching his skin, and Choji's sheer presence forcing him into a defensive stance. For the first time in years, Lee felt cornered. His usual strategy of overwhelming his opponent with speed wasn't working. Choji was too versatile now, too determined, and Lee was taking more damage with each passing moment. Finally, Choji slammed his hands to the ground again, bellowing out a swell of flame, causing it to encircle them both. The flames roared upward, trapping Lee with no clear escape. Choji stepped forward, his gaze fierce. "Nowhere to run," he said, his voice low and resolute. Lee's breathing had become heavy, his body marked with burns and scrapes. He looked at Choji, realizing just how much his old friend had changed. "Choji," he said quietly, his tone lacking its usual cheer. "I hold no ill will towards you." Choji paused for a fraction of a second, caught off guard by the sincerity in Lee's voice. That moment was all Lee needed. With a sudden burst, he launched himself upward, aiming for the narrow gap above the flames. Choji reacted quickly, throwing a barrage of earth spikes towards him, but Lee twisted in midair, avoiding the worst of the attack. As Lee landed on the other side of the fire, he stumbled briefly, his leg trembling from exhaustion. "Forgive me," he said softly, not turning back, "but I must continue." Choji watched as Lee disappeared into the maze, his fists still clenched. He exhaled heavily, the fire around him flickering before extinguishing. Though he hadn't stopped Lee, the fight had shown him something important. "Next time," Choji muttered to himself, his voice filled with determination. "Next time, I'll finish it." Lee moved swiftly through the maze, his mind focused and calm. He could feel the faint stirrings of his ki, the passive energy that allowed him to manipulate his surroundings. The air around him seemed to shift as he ran, the path ahead subtly illuminated by his presence. He slowed when he heard a familiar voice nearby. Turning a corner, he saw Neji and Hinata waiting for him. "Neji! Hinata!" he called, his voice filled with relief. "Lee," Neji said, nodding. "We've been waiting. Let's move." Lee frowned, his eyes flickering with concern. "What about the others?" "Forget them," Neji replied curtly. "I made sure to evade them." Hinata hesitated, glancing back down the corridor. "But what if they find us?" "They won't," Neji said firmly, his tone leaving no room for doubt. "But if they pull out a miracle, I'll make them regret it." "Lee!" Hinata gasped, realizing in the darkness the injuries he had sustained. "It is nothing," Lee insisted to reassure her. "Some simple scrapes from Choji." "You let Choji injure you?" Neji asked, his voice laced with condescension and a sneer to follow. "You would do well not to underestimate your classmates, Neji," Lee warned, wondering in the moment if Neji's attitude had worsened in his time away, or if he had learned any level of humility. "Choji!" Ino shouted down a corridor nearby, but her voice didn't even echo. "What kind of seals were put on these walls?" Kiba wondered, sliding his hand along the nearest one. "I can't smell at great distances. They don't allow echoing. It's actually pretty annoying for us sensors. I'm so used to smelling everything in a wide radius. It's like my nose is stuffed." While Ino and Kiba continued their search for Choji, their only competition was on the move. Neji moved confidently through the maze, his Byakugan revealing every trap and hidden pathway. He didn't just lead, he commanded, barely acknowledging his companions as he darted ahead. "Try to keep up," he said curtly, his tone dripping with superiority. Rock Lee, as ever, followed with his characteristic enthusiasm, despite injured, though he was uncharacteristically quiet after their earlier challenges. Hinata trailed slightly behind, her Sharingan flickering on and off as she tried to balance its activation with her Byakugan. When a sudden haze of Genjutsu descended, the team faltered. Hinata's Sharingan spun as it tried falsely to see through the deception, but her vision became blurred and distorted. Hinata found herself standing alone in the maze, and soon her surroundings transformed into the Hyuga clan's compound. She saw her father standing proudly at its center, his back turned to her. She hesitated, a mix of longing and dread rising in her chest. When he turned, his expression was one of disappointment, his eyes cold. "You were supposed to be the heir of the Hyuga clan," he said, his voice like ice. "Yet you've sullied yourself with an outsider's eye, a Sharingan. It doesn't belong to you, it belongs to evil. How can you lead with something like that isn't even yours?" The words cut deep, striking at the silent doubts that had haunted her since receiving Sasuke's Sharingan. Her Byakugan too activated instinctively, scanning her surroundings, and she realized that her father's chakra signature is wrong, an unnatural erratic flow that betrays the illusion. She steels herself, knowing this isn't real now, but the Genjutsu doesn't waver. Suddenly, though, the scene shifted. She's surrounded by faceless clan members whispering accusations. "She's a disgrace!" "She's not a true Hyuga!" "How can we follow someone so weak?" As the voices grew louder, her Byakugan faltered. She tried activating her Sharingan, but when she did, it burned painfully, as though rejecting her entirely. The pain forced her to her knees, and she clutched her face, feeling the weight of both her heritage and the foreign power she now carried. The faceless members of her clan twisted into one oversized titan of one person, whose face lit up to reveal Naruto's. "You turned your back on me for his favor?" Naruto sneered, pointing at the shouting gun in her head. "Forget your family and forget me for his love? The depths you have stooped." No," Hinata crumbled, ducking her head to the ground, dreading what else may come. Rock Lee pushed deeper and deeper into the maze as the dim corridors began to shift. The stone walls morphed into a dojo he knew well, his old training ground with Team Guy. The room glows with an almost dreamlike quality, but Lee was fixating too much to notice the irregularities at first. He saw Might Guy standing at the center, his back straight, arms crossed, a serious expression etched onto his face. "Lee," Guy says without turning around, "you've become strong, but strength alone isn't enough. You've lost your way." Lee freezes, his chest tightening. "What do you mean, Sensei? I have trained harder than ever. I am becoming the man you believed I could be." Might Guy turns his face to him, his expression unreadable. "Have you? Depending on this ki over the training I've given you? True strength is not something found in your imagination, but in your fists." Before Lee can respond, he hears another voice, his own, but distorted. It echoes from the shadows, mocking and jeering. "You will never be enough. Not without ninjutsu or genjutsu. You are just a pale imitation of the real shinobi around you." Out of the shadows steps a version of himself, dressed in white, his expression cruel and taunting. This doppelganger sneers as he performs a perfect sequence of ninjutsu. Fireballs erupt from his hands, lightning crackles around his fists, and earth rises beneath his feet. "See?" the doppelganger laughs. "You cannot even dream of being as strong as I am." Lee gritted his teeth, but doubt crept in nonetheless. The image of himself wielding ninjutsu, the one thing he can never have, shook him to his core. All while Might Guy remained silent, watching with a disapproving look that cuts deeper than any blow. Suddenly, the dojo shifts again, and he's surrounded by his teammates. Neji struggles against invisible chains, and Hinata's voice cries out for help from somewhere beyond his reach. No matter how fast Lee runs, or how hard he tries to help, they remain just out of reach. The doppelganger sneers. "You will fail them too, just like you have failed yourself." They were right, weren't they? Lee may well have never developed anything beyond taijutsu. Without any defense against the genjutsu, what did he hope to have to defend them? Neji, of course, was entirely unaffected. His Hageshi Byakugan left him immune in this genjutsu. He turned to see his teammates frozen in their respective illusions, their expressions contorted in pain or despair. "Pathetic," he muttered under his breath. With a flick of his wrist, he delivered a sharp burst of chakra into each of them, breaking the illusions instantly. Hinata gasped, her Byakugan and Sharingan snapping back to focus and deactivating, while Rock Lee stumbled and looked at Neji in gratitude. "Thank you, Neji," Lee panted, bowing slightly. Neji crossed his arms and gave them both a cold glare. "If I weren't here, you would both still be wallowing in your insecurities. Do better." Hinata lowered her gaze, shame burning in her cheeks, a shadow of pain lingering in her Sharingan eye, while Lee gave a small sheepish laugh. Neji turned sharply and continued forward. "Let's go. I won't waste any more time for you to recover from such simple tricks." Elsewhere, in the unknown depths of the maze, Kiba found himself surrounded by an opaque cloud without scent. His gray surroundings shifted into the bustling streets of Konoha. At first, he felt a pang of relief, familiarity, normalcy, but the moment he stepped forward, the villagers' faces twisted into expressions of disgust and contempt. "Kiba?" came a voice from his right. He turned to see Naruto, Sakura, and Ino standing together, their expressions cold. "You really thought you could just brush off what you did?" Naruto said, his tone biting. "You almost ruined everything." I didn't mean to," Kiba stammered, stepping back. I thought you thought wrong, Ino said, her voice sharp like a whip. You're reckless, Kiba. Always have been. Sakura crossed her arms. Why do we even keep you around? You're such a liability. The crowd around them grew, their voices rising in a chorus of ridicule and condemnation. Akamaru, who had been by Kiba's side moments before, vanished. Kiba looked around frantically, his breath quickening. Because of you, our Hokage could have died, Tenten continued, stepping out from the crowd. Because of you, we could have killed each other, Hinata accused from her hospital bed, still fighting for her life. Because of you, we lost trust in each other, Shino's deep murmur reverberated through the ground. Because of you, the Akamichi are a laughingstock, Choji growled, matching a tone similar to Akamaru's. Akamaru? Oh, where are you? His voice cracked, but no one answered. The mocking words pressed closer, the words digging into every insecurity he'd buried. Pathetic. You don't belong here. Why don't you just leave? Kiba dropped to his knees, his hands clutching his head as their laughter echoed into his ears. He wanted to scream, to fight back, but the weight of their judgment left him paralyzed. Ino's genjutsu was subtle at first. The maze around her seemed to stretch endlessly, the walls twisting and shifting in ways that made her head spin. Then she heard the low growl of a beast. She turned sharply, her heart racing, as a massive shadow loomed before her. It was Isobu. The three-tailed beast towered over her, its single eye glaring down with malevolent intent. Behind it, Konoha burned. The screams of her friends and family echoed constantly, layered around her. This is what you bring, Isobu's voice rumbled, deep and guttural. Destruction. Chaos. They'll never trust you. Not really. Not when you have me. Ino stumbled back, her hands trembling. No, that's not true. The beast's laughter shook the ground. Is it? You felt their fear. The way they look at you, they know you're a danger. Even your closest friends hesitate to trust you. What happens when I lose control, Ino? What happens when I break free? Sudden flames exploded around her, rising towards the infinite sky, and Ino felt tears prick her eyes. She clutched her head, trying to block out the beast's voice. But then, from deep within her, Isobu's voice spoke again, calm and steady this time. This illusion is beneath us, Ino. Remember who you are. Remember who I am. Ino's eyes snapped open, and her chakra flared. You're my power, she said, her voice firm. And I am yours. With a surge of determination, she dispelled the illusion, the flames and the elusive Isobu's taunting laughter fading into silence. Then, faintly, Kiba felt a hand on his shoulder. Kiba, snap out of it! Ino's voice cut through the din like a lifeline. Her chakra surged into him and the illusion shattered. Kiba gasped, his vision clearing to reveal the maze once more. He met Ino's gaze, his expression raw. I didn't. It's okay, she said firmly, kneeling to his level, seeing the despair threatening to take him. Keep a hold of my hand. Choji stood in a dark void, the walls of the maze gone. Before him, Nagato appeared, his Rinnegan glowing ominously. You think you've gained power, Nagato said, his voice calm but cutting. But what have you sacrificed to obtain it? Images flashed around Choji, his family, his friends, the village. Each one crumbled to ash, leaving him standing alone. This is the price of power, Choji. Do you truly believe you can wield what I've taught you without consequence? Do you think your hands are clean? Choji clenched his fists, his body trembling. I trained to protect my friends, to protect the village. And yet here you are, Nagato said, stepping closer, questioning your every move, wondering if you've already crossed a line you can't return from. The void seemed to close in, suffocating him. Choji tried to move, but his limbs felt heavy, as if weighed down by his own doubts. No, Choji muttered, attempting to break free from his heavy body. He knew the void. No, you killed the only people I cared about. And then you ran from me, Nagato laughed. You fled for the village to pass the buck, to hand the responsibility of defeating me to someone else. All for naught. All you have done is doomed the rest of the people you care about. You're wrong, Choji growled as his will finally overtook the mental terror coursing through his mind. I'll break out of here. I'll break free from what holds me. And then, when we find ourselves face to face again, I'll break you. Shouting with ferocity, Choji willed himself to his feet and, fighting against the illusion's oppressive force, began running down the hallway. Choji shouted furiously as he picked up more and more speed down the halls of the maze, until at long last, as if hitting and snapping through a thin membrane, he found himself collapsing onto grass. Neji, Hinata, and Rock Lee were already waiting when Choji stumbled in, his breath heavy, but his resolve intact and stronger than ever. Just moments later, Ino and Kiba arrived together, their expressions tense but relieved. Jiraiya's voice echoed through the room. Congratulations! You've all passed the first phase! Looks like you've got more grit than I thought! Neji huffed. Some of us more than others. Hinata and Lee exchanged sheepish glances, while Ino and Choji gave Neji a sharp look and stepped towards him. If you've ever prayed for anything, pray that you won't face me later, Choji warned ominously, turning his head to Lee and echoing the same sentiment, before distancing himself from the two groups to cool down. You might have this new fangled Byakugan, but I have a tailed beast, Ino glared. You use yours, I'll use mine. Right, Neji scoffed, rolling his eye in exasperation at their fervor. Well, that turned out boring, Karin pointed out as she, Shino, Shikamaru, and Tenten sat together in a dimly lit conference room, having been summoned without prior notice. I wonder if they built that whole maze just for those 6, Tenten asked aloud. Actually, now that I think of it, the chunin exams do change in content every time, Shikamaru explained. The classroom is one of 6 different variations, I think. The forest always remains the same, and then there are like 4 or 5 variations of Phase 3. Are they getting a tournament this time, like when we went through? Shino asked. I have no idea, Shikamaru shrugged uncertainly. The 4 of them sat together in silence after this. The air of secrecy was palpable, the silence punctuated only by Karin's impatient tapping of her fingers on the table. She leaned back in her chair, frowning. If they're going to make us wait, they could have at least brought some tea, she muttered, glaring at the ceiling. What's with the cloak and dagger crap? Be patient, Karin, Shino said, resting his chin on his hand. His tone was calm but firm, a thin veil over his own curiosity. If this meeting was called this late, it's clearly important. Doesn't mean they have to waste our time, Karin huffed, crossing her arms. I could have been doing literally anything else. Could you be quiet for once? Tenten's voice cut in, sharper than usual. Her arms were crossed, her brows furrowed with concern. This doesn't feel like a regular briefing. Shikamaru stood and paced in a short weave silently. His hands were clasped behind his back, his posture stiff. Though his expression was plain, the faintest movement of his head indicated he was listening intently. The tension broke as the door opened. An Anbu operative stepped inside, his face hidden behind a porcelain mask painted with a wolf design. He wasted no time with pleasantries, striding to the center of the room and spreading a scroll on the table. This mission comes directly from the Hokage's desk, the Anbu operative began, his voice low and commanding. You're being deployed immediately. Karin frowned. Immediately? Don't we get a— No, Shikamaru interrupted, his sharp eyes locking onto the Anbu. What's the situation? The Anbu nodded approvingly. 3 hours ago, a group of unidentified individuals infiltrated the village. They broke into a secure archive and stole several forbidden jutsu scrolls. Our initial assessment suggests they are of the same group that previously attempted to abduct Hanabi Hyuga 4 years ago. Tenten's expression hardened. The bald guys? Again? Yes, the Anbu confirmed. And based on the intelligence gathered from their last incursion, we believe they have a base of operations outside the Land of Fire near the border. They have proven capable of evasion and concealment, but the stolen scrolls cannot fall into the wrong hands. You are to locate them, confirm the presence of the scrolls, and recover them. Karin shifted uncomfortably, biting her lip before hitting Shino, the next closest person, in the shoulder. And what if they don't hand them over willingly? Shino asked, his voice measured and calm, ignoring Karin's impatience and shrugging off the hit. The Anbu looked at him. You are authorized to use any means necessary, however, collateral damage is to be avoided, and the scrolls must remain intact. Typical, Karin muttered under her breath. Risk our necks for some old scraps of paper. Shikamaru shot her a sidelong glance but said nothing, turning his focus back to the Anbu. Do we have any intel on their numbers or abilities? The operative nodded. Preliminary surveillance suggests a core group of 6 individuals. Each has demonstrated proficiency in taijutsu and basic ninjutsu. However, it is unclear if any of them possess advanced techniques or kekkei genkai. Expect resistance. Tenten tightened her fists. And the stolen jutsu? The scrolls include techniques from the second Hokage's personal archive, the Anbu said. Water-style jutsu, shadow manipulation techniques, and at least one related to explosive tags. We cannot allow them to weaponize these against us or our allies. Great, Karin muttered again, louder this time. So we're outnumbered, probably outclassed, and playing catch-up? Not outclassed, Shikamaru corrected, leaning forward. His voice dropped, carrying a weight of determination. We'll find them, and we'll stop them. The Anbu straightened. You leave in 20 minutes. Report to the village gate. Everything else you need to know is in the scroll. Dismissed. With that, the Anbu vanished in a puff of smoke, leaving the room in tense silence. Karin stood up abruptly, scowling. This is insane. They expect us to go on a suicide mission with nothing but scraps of intel? Quit complaining, Tenten said coldly. We have a job to do. These baldos sound like trouble. Maybe we should bide our time. Karin wondered, shifting in place. We cannot let them get away, Shino reasoned. There's a reason this is urgent. It's time sensitive. Shikamaru picked up the scroll, his eyes scanning the contents quickly. He sighed. Troublesome as always, but we'll manage. Shino adjusted his glasses. If they're sending us, it means they trust us to handle it. Or they're desperate, Karin retorted, though there was no bite in her voice this time. Maybe we should reach out to allies for intel. No time. Shikamaru refused the suggestion, tucking the scroll into his pouch and rising to his feet. Everyone gear up. We're moving out. The second Hokage is known as an inventor, Tenten mused as they filed out of the room. Most of his inventions were locked away because they were too dangerous for regular use. As the group left the room, the weight of the mission hung heavy in the air. Hopefully those baldies don't figure out how to use the jutsu before we catch up to them, Karin muttered with real concern. They each knew that failure wasn't an option, not with forbidden jutsu on the line and the village's safety at stake. And that's the end of today's episode. I really needed to squish down the intro and outro today to keep the length reasonable. Obviously, we're having a significantly greater personal challenge for the 6 in the chunin exams so far, but it's obviously flared some of the personalities and pushed down others. And in the face of competition, Neji's letting his unlikable side out again. Without any clear antagonists for everyone to pit themselves against, Neji just shines as the clear outlier. Of course, Shikamaru's ragtag emergency group has Karin, so there'll be some antagonizing on both sides. I ended up having to divide time between the 6 Genin individually, so I'm slightly concerned that the episode might feel a little bit chaotic. It shouldn't be too bad though. But I'll see you all next time. The sky's the limit!